Thank you for joining Team Epsilon in this literature review journey. In this literature review, we will be examining the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the Canadian justice system. The research question that we have chosen is, what are the top 3 factors that impact the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the Canadian justice system? Our hypothesis is, if the top 3 factors that impact the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the Canadian justice system are identified, then the discovery of the appropriate research method to address this problem will be found. Our research ideas began with possibly focusing on adult, youth, or gender factors, or pinpointing where when the problem starts, for example, pre-sentencing, during incarceration, or recidivism, and also the possibility of looking into assessing personal experiences. Some of the factors that were researched in our individual journal articles include Indigenous youth and adult risk factors, tailored culturally relevant programming, discrimination in the sentencing process, effects of intervention in the early to middle adolescent years, the effects of over-incarceration of Indigenous individuals over the course of a lifetime, the context of colonialism, demographic factors, and statistics. Next, we'll be looking at the results of the research studies of our individual journal articles in chronological order. First article we considered is entitled "The Overrepresentation of Indigenous Youth in Canada's Criminal Justice System: Perspectives of Indigenous Young People" by Carla Cesaroni, Chris Grahl, and Caitlin Fredericks, and was written in 2019. Cesaroni and others determined that colonization and residential schools had a direct connection with the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people in the criminal justice system, and this has resulted in the Indigenous youth losing ties to their community. In an attempt to reduce the overrepresentation of Indigenous young people, it should be of utmost importance going forward that the Indigenous youth not lose touch with his or her heritage, history, language, community, and anything else that is an integral part of the culture of the Indigenous individual. As well, involving the Indigenous community in a genuine way in programming for Indigenous young people in an attempt to better connect Indigenous young people with their Indigenous identity. This study done by Cesaroni and others in 2019 provides a platform for Indigenous youth's opinions and perspectives regarding their overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. The participants studied reported the importance of the involvement of their elders and the experiences of those from their culture who have shared similar experiences. This ultimately promotes the implementation of youth-centric programming for Indigenous youth, which is developed in partnership with the Indigenous youth community. Article 2 is entitled "Predictive Accuracy of Static Risk Factors for Canadian Indigenous Offenders Compared to Non-Indigenous Offenders: Implication for Risk Assessment Scales", written by Bronwyn Perley, Robertson, L. Mike Helmus, and Adele Forth in 2018. Perley Robertson and others hope to understand why and improve risk assessments with Indigenous offenders by examining potential static risk factors contained in an assessment used by the Correctional Service of Canada. This study found Indigenous offenders scored higher on many static factors, particularly those assessing criminal history. However, they determined that removing non-predictive indicators and only focusing on indigenized risk factors should improve the accuracy of the assessments. Article 3 is entitled Culturally Relevant Programming versus the Status Quo, a meta-analytic review of the effectiveness of treatment of Indigenous offenders, written by Letitia Gutierrez, Nick Chadwick, and Kyla A. Wanamaker. In 2018. The results of Gutierrez and others' 2018 analysis of 7 studies of tailored culturally relevant programs showed equivocal results, in many cases with little to show in others. For example, in Canada, the rate of overrepresentation in Indigenous peoples has increased in the last 2 decades. The authors determined that agencies need to be flexible and work towards a what works best for whom rather than assuming a one-size-fits-all approach in order to reverse the damaging legacies of colonization. Next, we move on to Article 4, which is entitled Years of Life Lost to Incarceration: Inequities Between Aboriginal and Non-Aboriginal Canadians, written by Akwazi Owazu Bempa, Steve Canters, Eric Droutz, Kabaraj Tour, Catherine A. Muldoon, John W. Farquhar, and Eric Mills, written in 2014. The results of the Owazu, Bempa, and others' 2014 analysis confirmed that there were substantial differences in life years lost to incarceration for Indigenous versus non-Indigenous Canadians. The number of years lost varied between provinces. However, at the federal level, Indigenous individuals lost an average of 6 times as many life years compared to non-Indigenous Canadians. The authors identified a variety of social impacts associated with incarceration, such as increased aggression and behavioral problems in the child of the incarcerated, effects on the family structure, and limits on future economic opportunities. These factors were determined to not only have detrimental health effects, but have many adverse social consequences as well. Moving on, we looked at the article entitled The Impact of Indigenous Status on Adult Sentencing, a review of the statistical research literature from the United States, Canada, and Australia, by Samantha Jeffries and Christine E. W. Bond. And this was written in 2012. The results of the study by Jeffries and Bond were somewhat inconclusive. There was evidence found suggesting that at times Indigenous offenders are treated more leniently than non-Indigenous offenders. However, a similar number of studies found that Indigenous offenders were in fact at a disadvantage in sentencing. While much of the information was inconclusive, the study did highlight the fact that the relationship between indigeneity and sentencing remains underexplored, and that future research is needed in this area. Our final article that we looked into is entitled The Offending Trajectories of Youthful Aboriginal Offenders. It was written by Annie K. Yassin and James Bonta in 2019. Yassin and Bonta determined that an Indigenous Canadian can expect to lose considerably more life years to incarceration than a non-Indigenous Canadian, and that Indigenous individuals are overrepresented in the correctional system. The authors also determined a growing body of research that establishes the negative health effects that come with incarceration and suggest that these negative health effects must be taken into consideration when considering incarceration as a sentence, especially for the Indigenous individual. When comparing research methods of our journal articles, we noted that a lack of mixed method approach was missing. We determined that any future studies should address this and include both quantitative and qualitative data within the same study. This may be done by assessing the perspective of Indigenous individuals who are currently involved in the criminal justice system and comparing with quantifiable data that has been collected throughout the study. In preparation of our justification, we came across some alarming statistics and would like to share these with you as our justification of importance. In 2017-2018, Indigenous youth aged 12 to 17 made up 43% of admissions to correctional services in the 9 reporting jurisdictions, while representing about 8% of Canadian youth population. Among the 8 jurisdictions that have reported correctional admissions consistently over the last decade, the proportion of Indigenous youth admissions to correctional services increased from 26% in 2007-2008 to 43% in 2017-2018. Indigenous youth are overrepresented in both custody and community supervision, making up 48% of custody admissions and 39% of community admissions in 2017-2018 in the reporting jurisdictions. In 2017-2018, Indigenous adults accounted for 30% of admissions to provincial, territorial custody and 29% of admissions to federal custody, while representing approximately 4% of the Canadian adult population. Statistics Canada conducted a special study using record linkage procedures to explore an individual's recontact with the criminal justice system. A recontact study with the Saskatchewan justice system found that Indigenous people were significantly more likely than non-Indigenous people to have recontact with police following correctional involvement. In order to better identify and address ethical issues, our team extended our research to Chartrand 2019, where he proposes that by altering the underlying colonial relationship, we are not only denying that colonialism continues to exist today, we are still trying to do away with colonizing practices as part of the solution. In order to better identify and address ethical issues, our team extended our research to Chartrand 2019, where she proposes that by altering the underlying colonial relationship, we are not only denying that colonialism continues to exist today, we are still trying to do away with colonizing practices as part of the solution. We addressed 2 limitations of the research. 1, the ability to accurately tailor research to the different subcultures of Indigenous communities across Canada. And secondly, the availability of international or national research and statistics, as well as the quality of the research, may be hard to find or unknown. We're going to go ahead with our checklist of future research considerations. First, we want to assess risk factors for offending, consider risk factors to facilitate clinical decision-making and contribute to a refined evidence-based diagnostic system, examine demographic factors, also investigate the overrepresentation of Indigenous people at all stages of the process of criminal justice, from the police to the judiciary to the correctional systems. We also want to use longitudinal studies that collect data over an extended period of time into adulthood extend research age variations, consider age differentiations between gender and within a racial group. As well, try to exclude any unintentional bias brought up by gender profiling or other factors. We want to consider different perceptions surrounding blame and risk, incorporate measures of offense context, include mitigating and aggravating circumstances, avoid stigmatization, and determine how cases are constructed and framed qualitatively. Finally, we want to acknowledge the impact of the fact that overrepresentation of Indigenous people within Canada's justice system is not due to a single factor. It is alternatively a wicked problem, affected by many different factors. We also want to take special care to consider history and damages caused by colonialism, and review access to culturally relevant programs and why they have worked outside Canada. The three factors that impact the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the Canadian justice system are: culturally tailored programs are not all successful. 2, there is not enough data available to determine what culturally relevant information is in order for it to be meaningful to Indigenous offenders. And 3, indigenized information and programs have to be tailored and regionally specific. By identifying these three factors, research can now analyze and compare which programs have worked successfully in countries like Australia and which have not. Determining what the dependent variables are will help devise a theoretical relationship between them. Using an applied approach, we can design a study that will determine the social ecology of the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian justice system. Future research should take a blended approach, combining culturally relevant components with conventional principles of effective correctional programming, which may ultimately be necessary to achieve the best outcomes, with neither component sufficient on its own. Addressing these questions, however, relies on a more significant commitment on the part of researchers, practitioners, and governments to support higher quality examinations of these issues in the future.